Okay, I'm ready when you are.
All right. Time starts now. We affirm our contention run is suicide terror. Mohammed and the CTC in 2009 reports that no suicide attacks were recorded in Iraq prior to the U.S.-led invasion in March 2003. However, all this changed once the U.S. intervened. Harvard University of Chicago in 2014 finds, from the perspective of local groups in the Persian Gulf region, there is no impartial American military policy. Americans might believe that we are fighting for humanitarian reasons, but we are viewed as foreign occupiers and become a target for terrorist organizations. Indeed, an analysis of over 2,200 suicide attacks over the last 40 years, POP quantified that 95% of such attacks are a response to foreign occupation. Let's see further that since the United States occupied Afghanistan and Iraq, suicide terror has risen sixfold. Crucially, The Guardian in 2020 reports that a reduction in U.S. military presence would cause a reduction in anti-Americanism and the targeting of American interests by terrorists. And overall, the Global Terrorism Index in 2017 finds that suicide terror is the most effective kind of terror, accounting for 43% of all terror deaths, with an average death rate of 14.2 per attack. And Richie of the OA in 2019 quantifies that over 26,000 people died from terrorism last year. Intention 2 is signaling the Saudis. As House of the Wall Street Journal in 2018 explained that for decades, Saudi Arabia preferred using checkbook diplomacy to ease potential problems and buy off votes. But now, emboldened by the United States, they've abandoned that legacy in a counterproductive effort to confront Iran. And this is because Clark of the National Interest in 2020 finds the U.S. supports Saudi Arabia in nearly all circumstances, emboldening them to take an aggressive position in regional struggles. They have an implicit security guarantee for an American troop stationed inside the country. And crucially, Benson of Vanderbilt in 2011 writes that unconditional compelling alliance like this increases the predicted probability of conflict by 249%. However, absent U.S. support, Ghaneen of the Middle East Monitor in 2019 explains that the Saudi military is inadequately organized, with personnel who have received insufficient training. Thus, here's the report that with large-scale U.S. troop downsizing, the type of military adventurism that produced the war in Yemen becomes less likely, and the Saudis may be incentivized to take a more compensatory line towards Iraq. This has happened in the past, as Parsley of Foreign Policy 2020 writes. But when President Trump declared his intentions to pull troops out of Saudi Arabia, the Saudis began exercising diplomatic options. They set the direct talks with Houthi rebels in Yemen in order to ease tensions with Iran, and there was an 80% reduction of Saudi-led airstrikes. If Saudi Arabia were to seek peace, Iran will reciprocate, as McGinnis of the American Enterprise Institute in 2015 explained that Iran is fundamentally a defensive state and principally concerned with its own stability and regime survival. Its military strategies and doctrines are reactive to the regional dominance of the United States and its allies. And Nyhouse of Towson University in 2019 confirms that Iran's support for its proxy militias does not emerge from revolutionary zeal, religious fanaticism, or dreams of territorial expansion. Instead, Iran depends on its proxy forces because it believes that it is the most effective way of ensuring its survival against foreign threats. The impact of preventing proxies. As Goldenberg of Foreign Policy in 2017 writes, that nearly every major conflict in the Middle East, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq has had some flavor of Iranian-Saudi competition. Problematically, Kenrick of Penn State in 2014 reports that when third parties like Saudi Arabia or Iran intervene in a civil conflict, it is 94% more likely to experience peace failure. Thus, these proxies have had disastrous results. For example, Summers of the Guardian in 2018 quantified that airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen could engulf the country in famine, with 13 million civilians at risk of starvation. And Fisher of the New York Times in 2016 concludes that the Middle East could be the next Central Africa, where interrelated wars driven by meddling regional powers have killed 5 million people. Thus reaffirmed.
Can I see the evidence that 95% of suicide attacks are a response to foreign occupation?
I'll get it, Randy.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I just sent it. Did everyone get it?
I haven't gotten it yet. Just give me a sec. I just got it.
Okay, cool.
All right. Sorry, that was 15 seconds of prep.
Is everyone good? Okay, cool. I will begin. Charlotte Latin negates. Contention 1 is curbing Iran. Alexander 19 of the Hill writes that Iran has undertaken terrorist and belligerent attacks for the better of 4 decades, while the American military has responded by countering Iranian aggression. To get a seat at the negotiating table, Maloney 19 of Brookings writes that Iran's provocations and aggressiveness are an attempt at good cop, bad cop. This excessive show of force, Iran hardliners hope, will force international bargaining with the nation. In fact, Riley 20 of CNN reports that Iran plans to use the death of Soleimani as an excuse to disrupt shipping in the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. Iran's closing of the strait would stop trade throughout the region, hurting both the U.S. and its global partners. Fortunately, Baldor 20 of the Military Times writes that the U.S. military presence has established stability in the region, decreasing the level of harassment in the strait. Without U.S. military presence in the Gulf, Iranian attacks would disrupt shipping. Iran has repeatedly attacked oil ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz, causing oil prices to spike. Snow 19 of Military Times writes that Iran was behind the numerous attacks over the summer of 2019 and attacked Saudi oil fields in September. Thus, U.S. military presence is key to curbing Iran's bullying of the oil supply, especially against smaller neighboring nations. Snow writes that although Iranian navies and armed forces threaten oil ships passing through the region, the U.S. protects the strait with its own marine units. He continues that last year, units were able to down Iranian drones and establish a security ring in order to ensure protection for oil supplies. The impact is economic devastation. The Energy Information Agency in 2019 reports that Saudi Arabia transports nearly 6 million barrels of oil per day through the strait. Iraq, with almost 4 million, is in second place. The OEC finds that 95% of Iraqi exports and 83% of Saudi exports are crude oil. Disterberg 20 of Forbes finds that 70% of Saudi governmental revenue comes from oil. The strait is necessary to protect the economies of Gulf countries, and even a partial blocking destroys their economies. Krauss 12 of New York Times warns that a closing of the strait would cause oil prices to skyrocket 50% or more within days, and even a partial blocking of the strait could push the price of gas to over $4 and the price per barrel to over $100, sending shocks across the global economy. Lucas 10 finds that for developing nations like those in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, increasing prices from $38 a barrel to $100 a barrel led to a 16 to 22% increases in poverty for developing nations importing oil and a 23% increase in poverty in the Middle Eastern states exporting oil. The World Bank 15 finds lower oil prices help lower inflation in developing countries, developing African countries, allowing central banks to keep rates steady. Lower oil prices led to increased consumer spending and sustained economic growth. Most importantly, lower oil prices allow under-resourced African nations to cut fossil fuel subsidies to alleviate budget pressures and reallocate funding to help benefit the poor. The ODI 15 quantifies further that having oil prices led to a 14% reduction in malnourishment, mostly in developing nations. Contention 2 is terrorism. DUEC 15, a foreign policy research institute, explains that in 2011, the U.S. made a costly mistake by withdrawing troops from Iraq prematurely. As a result, ISIS was able to instigate a bloody civil war. Statista finds that the number of deaths due to terrorism in 2016 reached almost 10,000. With U.S. counterterrorism efforts, that number fell to 1,500 by 2018. However, ISIS is not dead. Martinez 20 of ABC News explains that al-Baghdadi's death has not disrupted the militant structure or operations. Fortunately, Martinez continues, ISIS has struggled to attack U.S. or U.S.-Iraqi coalition forces. Pollock 20 of the Washington Institute quantifies ISIS has $300 million in reserves and is reorganizing underground in Iraq. In the final 9 months of 2019, the group was able to conduct 867 terrorist attacks. Keel 20 of the Hill writes that a withdrawal of military presence would mean an ISIS resurgence, given that most counterterrorism operations in the country are coalition-led, and the U.S. gives air, ground, and reconnaissance support. There are 2 impacts. The first is a loss of lives. Pollock estimates that both the size and severity of ISIS attacks would increase with U.S. withdrawal in Iraq. To quantify, during the Iraqi Civil War, casualties from terrorism reached nearly 30,000. The second is a humanitarian crisis. The UNHCR 19 writes that as a result of ISIS surge, 3 million Iraqis have been internally displaced, another 260 forced to flee the country, 2.3 million lack food, water, and safe shelter, millions of children have been separated from their families, contributing to higher levels of trauma and stress, recruitment into armed programs, and exploitations. About 2.1 million children can't access essential services because of lost documentation, and about 2.6 million do not have education because of a lack of resources. Thus, community.
Ready for cross?
Yeah.
All right. Can I get first question once we start?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Time start. No, okay. So why would the world just let Iran take over the Strait of Hormuz?
Quite simply because they can. Like Iran, that's the Baldor evidence, which is really key here. It's the fact that only the U.S. was willing to put up with like provocations with Iran, which is really key because the other nations just sat back and watched Iran harass.
Wait, so the rest of the world is willing to put up with like as
It's
you
not
say,
that it's
like
not that they're necessarily it's not that they're
$100
necessarily okay, wait, let me explain
per
this. It's not that they're necessarily willing to let it happen. It's that they don't band together and establish like a sort of security ring like the US does in that case. It's really important. Can I ask you a question?
Okay, wait, what is it? Wait, hold on. If like the world still like responds, why
No, the
does
world does
security
that's
ring
the key. The world doesn't respond. That's our Baldor evidence, which is really key uniqueness. It's the fact that when US had a low military presence in the region, they like quite simply didn't, and Iran was able to increase its harassment. Can I ask you a question now?
Wait, okay, yeah, sure.
Okay, so you impact to suicide terrorism. How exactly is suicide terrorism increasing in the status quo?
What we're saying is that suicide terrorism is linked to American occupation, right? What we tell you is that 95% of the suicide terror attacks have been because of foreign occupation.
So let's talk about that
the
95%.
entire reason for suicide terror. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk about the 95% evidence, right? That's from 2010. What happened in 2011 right after that when the US pulled out?
I don't know, you can probably tell me.
Yeah, sure. So Al-Qaeda in Iraq resurged and became a group called ISIS because anti-Americanism didn't go anywhere because it wasn't like military presence went away and everyone's like, oh, we love America now. But you can get
wait, hold on. Like on this whole idea of ISIS and like the U.S. to travel research, right?
Yeah.
This actually is my question. So is your contention to ISIS specifically based off of Iraqi troops? The U.S. staying in Iraq?
Well, I mean, we're not impacting to terrorism in Saudi Arabia or like Oman, so I guess it's Iraqi.
Okay, yeah. So your argument is saying that U.S. troops have to stay in Iraq, right?
Yeah, sure. They have to stay in the Middle East. They have to stay in the Middle East. Oh, wait, let me clarify that though. They still have troops in like Kuwait for like counter-terrorist measures, which is really key. It's the fact that like the U.S. is at the forefront of all coalition forces, which is really key.
Okay, wait, but why, if like, for example, if I have counter-terrorism used in like Kuwait, all they can really help with is intel at the most, right? Because they're not like troops on the ground, right?
I mean, they help with stuff like reconnaissance and air support, and all of those stuff are like really
important.
That's why Saudi Arabia has like 3 air bases.
Reconnaissance from like drones and different stuff. Okay, all right, cool. You want a question?
All right, cool. So you talk about how Iran is reactionary, right?
Yeah.
If we win that Iran's been funding proxies before the U.S. got involved, do we win contention too?
No, because what we're saying is sure. It doesn't matter what they were doing before, but the reason why they're funding proxies now is because in order to respond to U.S. aggression and U.S. allies U.S. intervention and the allies aggression.
Okay.
We'll take some. We'll take some prep. All right, we're good.
How much prep do you guys have left?
I'm not sure. Randy, do you know?
We took like a minute 40 right there. So we have a minute 20 left.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? It's just going to go right down their case. Let's start at the top of their case on Iran. What we'd say the first problem here is that they say that Iran is inherently a belligerent country. That is not true. What Hamid Aden of King's College explains that in the 1990s, before the United States intervened in the region, Iran was actually reaching a domestic peace deal with Saudi Arabia that could have prevented any of the conflicts that would have carried out in the Middle East in the coming years. The problem comes from House, who finds that insofar as the United States entered and allowed Saudi Arabia to get its emboldenment and aggress the region, that is the only reason that Iran has ever actually emboldened itself into entering any conflicts. In fact, in situations like Yemen and Syria, Iran only intervened after the Saudis intervened in the first place. That's why we would say the chances of Iran actually intervening are pretty low, because empirically they've only ever been a defensive actor. Their primary goal is to assure regime stability, and they have no interest in pursuing a goal like entering the Gulf, because that would A, not be very beneficial for them economically. I'll talk about that later, but B, it would invite major international backlash, which means they would be shunned by the international community and probably would end up losing more money than they make. Overall, an investment into an expansion for Iran is a disastrous investment for them to make. They'd much rather prefer to just use the oil they already have. But then let's go to their specific link here about entering the Strait of Hormuz. There's three problems. The first comes from Daniel of the Atlantic, finds that Gulf states have begun building up their own naval forces in order to prevent Iran from ever actually being able to enter the region. That means that A, there's a deterrent force against Iran entering, but B, it means that there's some force to prevent Iran from actually being able to successfully close the strait. But the second and more important response comes from Fox 43, who finds that if Iran were to close off the straits, allies of Iran and the international community, including allies like China, would continually pressure them. That's really important because Iran is reliant on these allies to make sure that it has some standing in the international community and make sure that it can actually carry out anything. They're not going to risk international isolation just to get a little bit more money from the strait. But regardless, we say they're probably not going to make that much money from the strait. Because what Fox 43 furthers is that 23% of Iran's GDP is oil. If, like they say, in the event that the strait was closed, oil-producing countries would end up getting screwed and they would see an increase in the amount of poverty they have, Iran is not going to make that investment because they're not going to risk losing 23% of their GDP. But finally, on the impact to economy, what we would say is that there's a couple of reasons that this is not actually going to occur. A, what we would say is that they have to prove that this specific increase in the Iranian ability to block the strait will cause this specific increase in a global recession. There's really no contextualization of this argument, and you have no clue whether it's going to cause the massive problem they talk about. And a lot of specific things have to happen. But second of all, what the Federal Reserve finds is that many countries, including the United States, have built up their own oil stockpiles in the event that a country like Iran prevents OPEC countries from exporting their own oil. And that makes sure that this massive recession that they talk about, or this massive economic problem in developing countries, wouldn't happen. But then let's go to their second contention on terrorism. At the top, we would say that we outweigh because Al Jazeera finds that Saudi Arabia funds these terrorism as part of its proxy wars against Iran. That's really important because the only reason that this terrorism exists in the first place is because Saudi Arabia is the person funding it in its effort to prevent Iran, and Iran funds it in return. That's really important because if the two biggest funders of these terrorism don't have that incentive to do so anymore, that probably takes out the majority of this link, and we're going to outweigh there. But regardless, on terrorism, what we'd say is that our link on anti-American sentiment probably is going to be a prerequisite of this too. In fact, what Bowman finds in 2012 is that Islamic countries with U.S. occupation are 10 to 20 times more likely to be attacked than those that don't have it. That means that the core reason for terrorism goes away when you affirm, and that's the reason you vote for us. But finally, what the Military Times explains is that Iraq has already forced us out, or is planning to force us out in the long run, because they don't like us in the region. They don't want our counter-terror forces there. And they say that you need reconnaissance missions, but you can do reconnaissance missions from other things. You don't need a military base to fly a drone over Iraq and survey terrorist organizations. They can still get that information. Overall, the United States military presence, the United States counterterrorism operations where it matters most are probably going to go away anyway, so you might as well take away the root cause why people do terrorism.
Okay, we're going to take running prep. Okay, yeah, that was a minute. Okay. Okay, I'll frontline first. At the top of our first contention, they say other countries are fighting Iran. Two responses. First of all, Baldor says that other countries don't fight Iran because they fear a provocative scenario. This is especially problematic because of Iran's aggression, indicating that only the United States can disrupt military expansion. But second, as you can outweigh, because Yeni Safak 18 writes that US, UK, and France have military bases in the Gulf, and the Associated Press in 2018 says that Britain only has one base in the entire Gulf, and France only has one in the UAE. Obviously, compared to the United States' 20 military bases, according to the American Security Project, they aren't having nearly close to the impact that America does in countering Iran. Second, they say that other forces are building up in the status quo. First of all, no quantification as to how much this is happening. Again, the United States has most of the influence in the region, but then they say that other allies are going to put pressure on Iran not to do this. First of all, Iran really doesn't care about international isolationism. Champion of 20 writes that Bloomberg writes that Iran is no longer integrated in the world economy. Global partners at a minimum because of economic sanctions. They have no interest in trading with Western nations, as indicated by the pulling out of the World Economic Forum. The implication is the global recession A either completely avoids them because of their isolationism, or B doesn't actually do that much damage. But moreover, we would argue that China is definitely anti-American. They would actually help Iran. They'd probably want them to do that anyway. But then third, they say Iran's not going to make its own money. They completely miss the nuance in our case. We say that Iran is going to let their own oil through. That's what enable bloc communities. They can let Chinese oil through, which means they don't actually have to hurt their allies. But then they say a stockpile means there's not going to be recession. Well, one, a stockpile can only last for so long. And second of all, they never quantify to you how much it actually has and how much this is actually going to mitigate a recession. We would say that at some point we still access our marginal impacts. But then you go to our second contention on terrorism. They say that Saudi Arabia funds proxies. We would say the terrorist groups definitely make their own money. Hezbollah, for example, makes $300 million a year by itself. And then second, they say the anti-US sentiment makes and attacks 10 to 20 times more likely. It's completely alt-causal. The United States intervened because attacks were more likely in the region and not the other way around. Third, they talk about how we can't go into Iraq. However, the policy is an attempt to make making it look like they no longer want to support. But in reality, what Iraq wants continued presence. SAB 20, a foreign policy writes U.S. troops are unlikely to leave Iraq, is indicated by the fact the bill is non-binding to the government. The Prime Minister likely wants the United States to stay in the region until stability is released. But moreover, we would argue that Ferber says the United States is actually needed in the region because Iraqi troops fell apart without the United States. That means that even if Iraq doesn't want the United States in there, which we'd argue they do, the United States can stay anyways. Go to their case. On their first convention about suicide terror, all their evidence is really outdated. The last piece of evidence from 2010. That means we tell you that since then, the United States has actually done a lot better, and suicide terror attacks have actually decreased since then. But then second, on their argument of the 95% card, there's literally no way to determine that. How are they going to ask the terrorists why they did the suicide bombing? Because they'd be dead at that point. But second of all, we'd argue they're always going to find another scapegoat because Code 15 reports that the anti-American sentiment is not going away. Continuing attacks in the past have created anti-American sentiment that will last for generations. But second, as you can extend the historical precedent, because when the United States leaves, the direct evidence from our case says that terrorist groups actually surge. But second is the Zenko evidence says the U.S. efforts have seen the number of ISIS fighters seen in Iraq more than half between 2014 and 2016. This means that even if the United States creates more anti-U.S. sentiment, that doesn't manifest in a growing terror threat. The Zenko also says that ISIS lost 80% of its territory due to the bombing campaign and coordination with ground forces. But also, we'd argue there are plenty of alt causes for this because Brand 17 knows that U.S. moral support for Israel, its non-military support to Arab regimes, and its cultural influence in the Middle East have been used as justifications for terrorist regimes. They're always going to find another scapegoat. But then, on their second contention about Iran. Okay. So first of all, Direct 15 says the United States downsides its military presence overseas. It unnerves its allies, which depend on material indicators of American commitment. Empirically, Iran's 18 roads explains when the Saudis perceived the United States was no longer committed to continuing Iran. They initiated the war in Yemen. But second of all, Iran is always going to be aggressive for two reasons. First is Maloney says they're expansionary to gain influence in the region. They did a good cop, bad cop strategy. And second, the Holbrook evidence says that the Iranian hardliners can always harp on sanctions. But second, prefer on historical precedent because Cole's 19 says Hezbollah was really founded prior to U.S. support. But then on U.S. and Yemen, they don't actually prove why these work. And also, the McKernan evidence says that Hezbollah that the Houthis are a decentralized insurgency without central command. They can never agree to a comprehensive treaty. And last, on the Farsi evidence, the Robla evidence explains this is completely wrong because the United States, this diplomacy actually increased when the United States had the most troops in the region as they ever had.
Wait, sorry, my Zoom or my headphones cut out for a bit. What did you say to Parsi?
I said the timeline is wrong because at the point where negotiations happened, the United States had the most troops in the region ever.
Okay.
Ready for cross?
Yeah.
Nice. The first question.
Yeah.
Okay. So you say Iran like good cop, bad cop. What's that?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, Iran starts proxy conflicts, like we talk about, because it wants a seat at a negotiating table. So because it's so internationally isolated, what happens is they start conflicts and then they scale back their aggression in order to be oh, we're not as aggressive anymore. Let's do some diplomatic talks, and so they can make small steps into getting what they want, which is regional hegemony.
Okay. Wait. So why can't Iran just enter the negotiating table otherwise?
So I couldn't hear you. Can you say that again?
Why can't Iran just enter the negotiating table otherwise?
Because no one wants them there. Because they're literally
Why does
internationally
no one-
isolated.
Other Middle Eastern countries clearly want to negotiate with Iran. That's the reason that they have all these conflicts in the first place. They'd rather end them. So why don't they just negotiate?
Right, but you're forgetting the part where the reason they want to negotiate with Iran is because Iran is doing something bad to them, and they want Iran to stop. But it's also not my job to tell you exactly what Iran's incentive structure is. As long as we can give you historical precedent about this is the way that Iran operates.
Okay.
This is
so
what
just to be clear, I'd say it's pretty important that you tell us why Iran does with us. But regardless,
I also do that. But
regardless, basically what you're saying is Iran wants to start wars, so then it can negotiate to get a better international standing.
Yeah, because so here's the thing. So if other countries negotiate with Iran, they don't really have So you're saying that Iran can negotiate sans being aggressive first, but the problem is then they don't get any concessions from the other countries.
I mean, I'm saying that like if Iran negotiates by being the belligerent first, it probably isn't great for their negotiations with other countries like don't want to deal with a belligerent country. Do you have a question?
I mean, sure, that's just Iran's strategy. Okay, so I guess on your first contention about suicide terror, has terrorism gotten worse since the United States was in the region?
Has terrorism gotten worse?
Yeah.
I mean, like I can tell you that like probably on like a broader scale for like big terrorist organizations like ISIS, maybe it's gotten a little bit better. But what I am telling you is that A, ISIS and a lot of other terrorist organizations still exist and have common resurgences, but B, suicide terror specifically has increased sixfold since the United States entered the U.S.
That's not true. That was in 2010. We post-date your evidence and say the number of deaths from terrorism, the statistic evidence from our case says it's actually decreased by like, I think it's about 9 times.
I mean, like, regardless, we'd say some level of like deaths from terrorism is probably pretty bad. Also, considering the fact that if you remove the root cause of terrorism, yeah, like if you remove the root cause of terrorism,
you're also
I'd say
making
that
a fundamental mistake here, right? Because you say that the root cause of terrorism is because of anti-American sentiment. That's not totally true. There are plenty of like really wealthy terrorists who don't.
For like a bunch of other varieties of terrorism, like, have other reasons. But the PAPE evidence says that 95% of suicide terrorists specifically have that reason.
Right, but then
and even if from 2010, the warranting still
makes any sense, right? Because how do they know that like the people did the suicide bombings?
They analyze what the motives of the group were. Like they see like what the group is targeting. They see what the group's belligerency in the past was.
I mean, I would argue that how can they tell that all of it's like
I mean, Robert Pape is like a pretty like well-established professor from Chicago. I don't think he just guesses a number and then publish it in a study. He probably had his reasons.
I mean, I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying that like the evidence doesn't make a lot of sense.
We'll run prep.
Is someone taking prep?
Yeah, we are. Could we call for the Parsi like response? Could we call for the card on the Parsi response, which says that like the U.S. had the most troops in the region during the negotiations?
Yeah, give me 1 second. Okay. The cards just list like the dates of when things happened to explain why Parsi is wrong.
It just lists the dates.
Well, it says like what happened in the States. So it's like the first one is like the United States put more troops in the region. The second card says that the negotiations happened, and the third, like, you know, the order of when it happened, just to prove that it wasn't the other way around.
All right. I'll tweet it.
Yeah. If you have questions, you can.
Yeah, that was all of our prep.
Okay.
Yeah. Order is gonna go my case, Wayne, and back on the stairs. Everyone good?
Yeah.
Alright. Time starting now. Starting off our contention with Saudi Arabia. This is where you're going to be signing the ballot for us. What we tell you is that Saudi Arabia, before our U.S. intervened, preferred to use checkbook diplomacy. However, they only became emboldened once the U.S. came into the region and started supporting them. That's really crucial because this emboldenment has caused Saudi Arabia to fund a ton of proxy work and make it become much more aggressive. However, if you vote out right now, the Saudi Arabia is going to become much more deep. If the U.S. begins to pull out, Saudi Arabia is going to become much less aggressive because they no longer have such a huge power advantage over Iran. And Iran is going to reciprocate to this because House evidence is really is a clean drop. It's really crucial here. It says that Iran is inherently a defensive state. They have a ton of insecurities about their security in the Middle East, and their main focus is on regime survival. So all of their actions, House analyzes all the motive behind all of Iran's actions that it does in the Middle East, and it is concluded that the reason why Iran does every single thing that, like every single form of like intervention and aggression, is solely in response to U.S. or Saudi Arabian aggression because of that. That's really crucial. And we're back to historical precedent. Because the Parsi card tells you that when Trump said he was going to pull out troops, Saudi Arabia ended up going to the negotiating table with Iran and began to have meaningful talks. This is really important because the impact of preventing proxy wars, the main proxy wars in the entire region in the Middle East, are being caused by Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're causing a famine in Yemen, are killing 13 million people, and are going to kill, in the proxy wars in the region, going to kill 5 million people in the region. On to Wayne. What we tell you is that if you buy a case, you cannot buy a contention to ISIS because Saudi Arabia funds terrorism, and so Saudi Arabia funds terrorism to try and boost the proxy war against Iran. So inherently short figure right there. Second of all, on the main contention of Iran, and we also say we outweigh their contention to ISIS on the sheer scope because they only impact out to a few 10,000 people dead, few numbers. But we impact to 13 million people in famine, 5 million people dead. And second, you also outweigh against the contention one of curbing Iran because if Iran no longer has a reason to aggress, if the U.S. leaves the region, they don't have a reason to suddenly go out and suddenly just attack and take over the Strait of Hormuz. If you buy our case, you don't allow their case to manifest. Well, onto what matter. They first respond saying the U.S. is downsizing the military, but we still say the U.S. because it's downsized a little bit, but it still has a lot of troops in the region, showing that it still has influence in the region. The second response is saying that Iran's always aggressive. No, the House evidence goes clean drop, and it's really, really crucial here. We'll tell you that Iran's entire first and primary goal is regime survival, and they're only all of their motives are behind trying to protect itself from our U.S. and Saudi Arabian aggression. The third response is that Houthis are decentralized, but the stronger evidence will tell you that the Houthis, the only way that they survive is by garnering support by facing Saudi Arabia's aggressors. So Saudi Arabia pulls out of Yemen, the Houthi party is going to collapse because they no longer have a way to take Saudi Arabia as aggressor. Their entire platform falls apart. The final response to the Parsi card, but still the issue is that Saudi Arabia still went to negotiations because Trump said that they were going to pull out. So at the end of the day, it still shows you that when the U.S. said they're going to pull out, they still went to negotiations. But also, we're compared to Iran. They do this problem. They don't properly respond to the fact that allies will pressure Iran. It just gives you that Iran's no longer connected to global markets, but Iran still 23% of GDP is still related to oil, so it's still connected to international oil markets. And second of all, China's not going to want to deal with $100 per barrel of oil, so they're clearly not going to want to try and so they're clearly not going to just simply allow Iran to take over the straits and spike up oil prices massively. This would hurt both their economies.
We're gonna take running prep.
I kind of missed it because you were cutting out a little bit, but could you tell me your first two front lines to their responses on signaling Saudis?
Yeah. So on the first response, I said that there's still a lot of troops, U.S. troops in the region. So it still shows that U.S. still has influence in the region and still has some sort of military presence, which aggravates Iran. And the second front line I said is that Iran's always aggressive, is that Iran's most important goal is regime survival. And the House evidence, which analyzes all of Iran's actions in the region, concludes but their motive is simply like as a retaliation to U.S. and Saudi Arabian aggression.
Okay, sorry, I'm gonna resume prep
Okay,
now.
thanks.
I paused during that because I couldn't hear. I had headphones in. So, all right. Oh, okay. We have 30 seconds left.
All right.
Okay.
Is everyone good? You'll start off on your C2. Start off on their contention to signaling to Saudis. There's a couple of problems with this. First, they say that Iran's defensive, but this is absolutely not true. They try to extend this Night House evidence through ink, but we have two responses that they drop. The first is from Cole, who says that Iran funded Hezbollah to fight Sunni insurgencies before the U.S. even got involved in 1982. That's important because Iran is never defensive, but they also drop Herbal, which says that they can hardline off sanctions instead of military presence. They literally just find something to scapegoat off of, but then they say that the U.S. made Saudi emboldened, but they drop the Brands evidence in rebuttal, which says that when Saudi Arabia perceived that the U.S. was about to leave, they attacked more because they feared losing the war, and they became more aggressive as a result of U.S. withdrawal. That's really important. But then they also say that Iran wants to negotiate. First of all, Iran and Houthis are not the same. Even if you buy that Iran wants to reciprocate, they're not the Houthis. And also Iran is always going to be expansionary. But then on the Houthi negotiation part, they completely drop the rebuttal that says that the Houthis will never agree to a comprehensive agreement because they don't have a centralized leader. That's really important because they literally killed their leader, which means that they're really dispersed and won't come to an agreement. And also it's a religious conflict. It's a question of Sunni versus Shia. It's not a question of diplomacy. But then they try to say that Saudi Arabia engaged in pressures because of U.S. withdrawal with their Parsi evidence, but they've got the timeline all messed up. It was first because of international pressure, not the U.S. military withdrawal, but their Parsi timeline is also messed up because the U.S. actually increased troops by 3,000 way before the ceasefire, which then tells you that it wasn't a U.S. military withdrawal, but actually an increase in it. It's not solvent, it's all causal. But then on the wing, they say that Saudis fought into ISIS. First of all, that's not true. But then they try to impact into proxy wars, but drop the fact that Iran literally sponsored Hezbollah, which is a proxy group, before the United States entered. Proxies are still going to be there, but then the solvency is with the neg, because we literally have the statistics to show that the United States is really good at fighting militants. So when they prop up, because Iran is always going to be expansionary, we are always there to fight them. That's really important. Go to our C2. We're winning on terrorism really cleanly because they don't extend any of their front lines. First, terrorism is going down in the status quo. Every time they talk about like this Pepe evidence about 95% of Saudi like suicide terrorism being as a result of like foreign presence, they don't get access to these impacts because we tell you in 2018 from Statista that the number of deaths dropped by 9,000. The Zengo evidence was basically conceded. They tried to outweigh, but they completely conceded the fact that 52% decrease in the amount of terrorist leaders, and they also completely dropped the two impacts of 30,000 deaths because of a civil war and 5 million people permanently traumatized, displaced, lack of education. These are all intergenerational impacts, which outweigh in magnitude because they don't give you a specific number as to their second contention of like signaling to Saudis. And secondly, they try to say like the war in Yemen is really big. They completely ignore the fact that the war on terror has lasted longer, and every time they tried to pull out, like in 2011, they immediately saw that terrorism reciprocated and increased. That's really important because we give you a clearer strength of link. It's the fact that when the US pulls out of the region, you immediately see an increase in terrorism. But secondly, we give you the impacts of that. Humanitarian crisis is probably the biggest impact in the round. They dropped the 5 million permanently traumatized and displaced. Those are intergenerational impacts. So we're winning on reversibility there, but we're also winning on magnitude and scope since they don't give you a terminalized impact there. They don't win off of diplomacy because diplomacy simply doesn't happen. And they also try to extend through ink. Iran is always going to be expansionary. There's always going to be conflict. It's better if the United States is there on the front lines.
Ready for grand?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Can I take the first question?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So let's talk about terrorism, right?
Sure.
So right now you say there's like a fall in like terrorist leaders, or you say like there's like a fall in terrorist leaders, a fall in deaths from terrorism. So like
There's the
how
attacks, everything. Yeah.
So how long until like the United States like campaign against terror finally like comes to its end and terrorism's wiped out?
We don't defend a number. We have no idea, honestly, but we're telling you that the status quo is solving back for it. And we also like tell you, we extend cleanly that like they can't pull out now because they literally have no incentive to, and Iraq doesn't want them to. So we don't take a stance on like when they leave, but we would say that like anti-Americanism is always going to be there. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Yeah. So you talk about how let's actually talk about this Iran negotiating strategy. Is Iran the one that needs to be doing negotiations, or are Houthis the one that need to be doing negotiations?
I mean, I would say that it depends on the scenario. Like in the vast majority of conflicts, I'd say it's Iran's the one that needs to be doing negotiations.
Okay, so I'm really
in Yemen specifically, I would say that the Houthis might have to do some negotiating on their own. But the Parsi evidence that both of us cite says that Saudi directly talks with the Houthis. But B, we tell you, insofar as Iran is the backer of the Houthis, if Iran pulls off its actual support for these groups, it doesn't matter if the Houthis don't want to engage. They lack access to resources to carry out their conflict.
So let's have a discussion about the Parsi evidence, because this is really important for like what actually happened objectively in like the timeline. What happened right before the Saudis reached out to the Houthis in terms of?
I mean, like, yeah, sure, they might have put in more troops, but the entire point of what I'm saying
is not that they put more troops. They put the most troops they ever did in.
That's like fine, but the point of what I'm saying isn't that. The point of what I'm saying is that insofar as that Parsi evidence says that or that Saudi Arabia negotiated with Houthis, that is a possibility that
I get that Trita Parsi says that, but Trita Parsi uses evidence that comes from the fact that they literally increased troop presence by 5,000. I'm honestly calling the question whether Parsi is true or not.
I'm just talking about the fact that like you say the Houthis can't negotiate, I say that they empirically have, regardless of what the scenario is.
No, our argument isn't that like Houthis can like get to the negotiating table. It's that because they're decentralized, no agreement works for them because like they don't have a leader. So even if they like find some sort of quasi leader, they end up like either killing them or like branching away from them like they did in the past.
The issue is, even if the Houthis are decentralized, the way that their like entire like fight against the government works is the way they garner support in general is by painting Saudi Arabia as the aggressor, right? So if Saudi Arabia leaves, the Houthis no longer have any way to garner support with the people in Yemen.
That's not true.
So they don't have an ability.
You're
why is it not true? You don't interact with the
Yes, we do. This is really important because you ignore what the Yemeni war is. It's a religious sectarian divide between Sunnis and Shiites. That's our second response to the reason why negotiations never happened.
Question?
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
All right, so
really 10 seconds. Yeah.
Is the war in Yemen like continually a problem?
Is it continually a problem?
Is it like still like a problem today? Are people still fighting in Yemen?
It's a problem that none of us can solve backward.
Okay. Is everyone ready? It'll go down my case and then go to their case. Let's start on our case where they extend a bunch of defense through ink. What we tell us through the House evidence is that previously Saudi Arabia was using checkbook diplomacy to engage with adversaries in the Middle East, but once the United States intervened, according to the Clark evidence, it emboldened Saudi Arabia to take more aggressive stances in Middle Eastern conflicts. That's really important because the Scalana evidence says that absent U.S. military, the Saudi military itself is incredibly weak, which is why Tisdall concludes, and this is never contested, that a complete U.S. withdrawal would mean the fact that the United States, that Saudi Arabia would be forced to take a more conciliatory line towards Iran. That's really important because the Nye House evidence that's also dropped says that the reason Iran fights proxy wars right now in the first place is because of the fact that they have to compete with foreign influence from Saudi Arabia. If that threat goes away, Iran goes back to being a defensive actor where it defends its own situation and just focuses on itself and doesn't engage in these proxy conflicts. The impact comes from Goldenberg, who finds that literally every single major Middle Eastern conflict is from Saudi-Iranian competition. And for example, in Yemen, 13 million people are on the brink of starvation, and 5 million people, according to the Fisher evidence, are going to die in the long term from these proxy wars if they continue. Let's start on their responses. The first one is that before Saudi Arabia intervened because it was afraid of U.S. withdrawal. The problem is the United States never fully withdrew, and that's why Saudi Arabia was able to continue the conflict because they had the continued security guarantee from U.S. troops in the region. If the United States had completely withdrawn, Saudi Arabia would not have been able to do that. But this is clean dropped in summary. But the second thing that's clean dropped in summary is that is the Nye House evidence that says that right now, empirically right now, not 1982 with Hezbollah, is when all of Iran's proxy conflicts are being engaged with because of foreign fears. That's really important because that means that the most current analysis says that the reason Iran actually acts is due to fear out of foreign influence. Sure, before they might have done that, but right now that is their major decision-making calculus, and the Nye House evidence analyzes every single conflict going on right now. It's way preferable to theirs. Finally, they talk about Iran and Houthis are not the same, and the Houthis are not going to be able to negotiate. The problem is, we tell you, A, from Parsi that the Houthis have negotiated before, and B, that Iran is going to be funding the Houthis, so if Iran loses the incentive to fight, then the Houthis lose the incentive to fight. Finally, they talk about how the timeline is wrong, but regardless, the current talks have failed. The war in Yemen is still continuing, as they say, so you still have something to fall back for, and the only reason that happens, so Tisdall finds that only the U.S. pulling out causes Saudi and Iran to fully end the conflict. That's really important because that outweighs their case on terrorism. Remember, if Saudi and Iran end their conflict, then both sides stop having proxy wars. That's really important because both sides stop having proxy wars. That gets rid of the instability and the need for terrorist organizations to be funded, which is a prerequisite to all of their impacts. That means that this is clean dropped in his summary, which means that we are always going to be winning this case. If you want to stop the most of these deaths from happening, you vote for stopping 13 million people from being killed, which actually is on scope, and this terrorism instability from occurring.
We'll take the last of our prep. Okay. Okay. I'm going to talk about our second contention on terrorism first. Okay. On our second contention about terror, that you say no defense in summary, cleanly extending direct evidence which says after 2011 ISIS research because the United States withdrew, or this TISTA evidence which says the United States that deaths from terrorists have decreased because of the United States presence in the region, and the pullout right now would cause more casualties such as the Iraq war, which killed 30,000 people, and the UNHCR says that there are over 5 million people who are literally starving and lack access to basic services. It's a really clear way to vote because pretty much all of it's uncontested. uncontested. They give you the weighing mechanism that these other groups are always going to fund proxies, which is a prerequisite to terrorism. That's totally not true. First of all, because these groups, even if they're funded by like larger organizations, they're still separate. Because, for example, we tell you that Hezbollah and the Houthis make their own money by doing other things. The groups just don't go away when Iran or like Saudi Arabia somehow becomes like more tilted towards diplomacy. But second of all, we have historical precedent for this because the whole evidence says that Iran was funding Hezbollah before the United States entered the region. We would argue that proxies are really non-unique. This is not a link into our case. A few reasons why we outweigh. One is improbability, because diplomacy has literally always failed. They can see this in their case. But counterterrorism has been empirically effective. That's why we have to continue it in the region, or else Steele says it would cause a resurgence, which would hurt millions of people. But second, we would argue that also like terrorism affects other conflicts, makes all these things worse. Like terrorism is happening in the war in Yemen as well, which means that we actually supercharge their impact when we say that when we try to stop terrorism. But then on their case, they drop a lot of defense. The most important piece of evidence is Brands, which says that when the Saudis perceived the United States was no longer committed to containing Iran, they started the war in Yemen. They missed the entire analysis that the reason that Saudi Arabia is so emboldened to begin with is because the United States perceived they were no longer a security guarantee. But then they missed some other defense, which is that Iran is always going to be expansionary. One, because they funded Hezbollah before the United States, and the Holbrooke evidence says that Iranian hardliners are always going to find a way to scapegoat the United States presence, for example, by sanctions. But moreover, they actually say that like Iran is different in the status quo. No warrants. We can use historical precedent. It's always been this way. But moreover, their timeline is historically wrong. Their Percy evidence makes no sense. The United States has had the most troops in the region when the negotiation happens. If anything, having more troops is on our side.